Welcome to this episode of Life Shot. Today we got a guest, Jake Ross, who is into international development. We're going to talk mostly today about education and climate change, as well as sustainability. We also get into some topics like capitalism. So I hope you enjoy. Stay tuned for this one.
We're kind of privileged to live lifestyles that have been supported by centuries of development, a lot of which has been at the expense of countries where we've taken resources, taken people even from, especially people in poverty. They make very careful decisions at the margins around these things. You know, do I send my daughter to school today, or do I need her to go and weed the field or look after her younger sibling? So we've ended up in this preeminent position where we're affecting, I think it's incontrovertible, I know some people will deny it, but we're having an effect on the biosphere. Our generation, my generation, is not providing the kind of leadership around these issues yet that is translating into action, as I say, at a big enough scale, across enough sectors, and urgently enough. The global dominance of the capitalist model in economics is pretty well absolute. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't challenge the power assumptions that underpin that dominant global setup.
Hey yo, it's the Life Shot podcast. Change your world and change the world.
A short disclaimer. The views that Jake Ross has in this interview are not necessarily those of his employer, Mott MacDonald, or Mott MacDonald clients. Jake Ross, welcome to the Life Shot podcast. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm very well, thank you. Welcome to Sawston, Clint.
Thank you, and thanks for having us in your garden.
Yeah.
So for the listeners who are not watching, you may hear birds in the background.
Yep.
Possibly a dog bark every now and then.
Yep, he's a little bit needy.
So yeah, nice relaxed environment, and Jake, it's good to have you on the show. I want to introduce you to the listeners. Just tell us about your areas of expertise and your areas of interest, and tell us about your recent trips.
So I work in international development, and specifically in the education sector. And our job is to work with governments overseas, usually using aid funding, and in my case often that funding comes from the British government, Department for International Development, to improve their education systems and provide better learning opportunities and future for children nationally in the kind of countries where we're working.
Is it mostly focused on children?
Yeah, in my career it has been primary and secondary age. I've also done some work on distance learning at the Open University of Bangladesh, for example. And a lot of our work involves working with adults, so the teachers obviously, but also head teachers, people in the community who support schools, all the district and local government officers who improve education services, and with states and national governments and politicians as well. So quite a range of adults whose job it is to provide learning opportunities to children.
Is it quite hands-on with the kids, or is it more just theory, telling the adults how to do stuff?
Right, well, no change happens unless teachers are doing something different with children. So at that level, yes, you have to maintain your focus on that relationship, those opportunities that children get in classrooms, often very impoverished, resource-poor classrooms. They need their teachers to be structuring their learning effectively. But at my level, I might be working in a project that reaches 6 million children. I'm not going to have a lot of hands-on contact.
Yeah.
Yes, I'll visit schools, state schools, non-state schools, religious schools, private schools, whatever the mix is in the country where we're working. But our job is to be building capacity for the people who are responsible for that system and for delivering it to do a better job according to their own objectives and those that are aligned to us as an international community.
Brilliant. Okay, so before we're going to talk about education a little bit later on, but before we get there, you've lived abroad in different countries actually to carry out your work. So that's it's quite an interesting aspect to your life. What's your experience been like?
Yeah, well, that's certainly been one of my drivers. I mean, it's a big planet. It's very culturally diverse, and I have always loved getting around it. So I've lived in Australia and Hong Kong. Started working there with refugees and asylum seekers voluntarily while I was teaching English and doing some proofreading, and quickly got taken onto the staff of an NGO, a non-governmental organisation that was providing education services in a camp for Vietnamese boat people, as they were called, that was back in 1989, who were leaving Vietnam for political and economic reasons, pitching up in countries like Hong Kong, interned in camps, and often they'd migrated as families, so the children needed some educational opportunities and some social activities, art and music and so on. That's what we provided, and I got a taste for it, stayed for a couple of years after I was taken onto the staff. And then once I'd started working professionally with Cambridge Education, my current employer, which is part of Mott MacDonald, after a while I moved to Bangladesh, worked in open and distance learning to begin with, and then for 4 years on primary education, strengthening the primary education system nationally in Bangladesh. So our 3 kids were born during that period in Bangladesh, returned to the UK for a bit. Then I worked on an HIV and AIDS program in Zambia for 3 years. Worked in Lao PDR for a couple of years in Southeast Asia on teacher education and education research, applied research. So our children got to grow up in those diverse cultures, Bangladesh, Laos, Zambia. Then we moved back to the UK. I worked for most of the next 7 years in Nigeria on a very large, long-running program.
So that was living in the UK, working for that
Nigerian
country.
I had periods when I was visiting Nigeria from the UK and periods when I was resident in the UK and visiting my family, or they would come out to see me. That was tough. Much as I love that country, it's an incredibly dynamic and challenging place, very vibrant, and a wonderful place to work. After a while, the strain of being away from your family tells, so I came back to the UK, and now I have a regional management job across West Africa, leading our programs in Ghana, Sierra Leone, Nigeria and elsewhere.
All right, so we want to talk about the first world and the third world, education, international development, and predominantly today we're talking about climate and the impact of that, and international development has got to do with that. And we were speaking just earlier before we turned on the recording that we currently doing the Prosperity Fund, which is looking at smart cities. So I think that those type of things are going to make the cities a bit more efficient and better to the environment, hopefully. Mm-hmm. But before we kick into that, do you think that the third world countries are maybe doing something that we are not doing for climate resilience that we could perhaps learn from? Is there anything like that that might shock us to know, or is there nothing?
I mean, if you don't mind, I would probably start by saying in my line of work I probably wouldn't use the terms first world and third world.
Sure.
Just because they carry some baggage around kind of what signals they're sending about how we're positioned relative to one another. I wouldn't say there's a preferred term particularly, but I tend to settle on kind of the global north, global south. There is a distinction there between more developed economies and less developed ones, and there's no perfect terminology, but that's how I would jump in at it. I mean, the way I see it, we in the West or the North, we're kind of privileged to live lifestyles that have been supported by centuries of development, a lot of which has been at the expense of countries where we've taken resources, taken people even from, and stacked the terms of trade over decades and centuries. And our privileged opportunities, our privileged lifestyles are predicated on that, and we don't often see it. We've now reached a point where I quite like the Sustainable Development Goals or the Global Goals framework that we're working within internationally and as a planet, because they balance the rights and responsibilities of people across the world. So, the fact that we would need, I think it's 2.4 planets if everyone was to live like us in Europe, for the resources to be, to support a lifestyle like this. If everybody on the planet lived as we do in Europe, for example, that's not sustainable. But it's not sustainable to think that people in developing countries should be held down at a level that supports us using more than our fair share. And Europe is by no means the worst place on the planet. Without, pointing fingers, I think it's something like 4 planets needed if you're living in somewhere like Dubai. Similar number in America, just because, the resource use is really unequal. So, are they doing things better in developing countries? I don't have a romantic view of the global south, but they're certainly not contributing as much yet to the global climate catastrophe that we're sleepwalking into, or at least not yet. So there's the opportunity there for them to be part of the solution, but there's equally a responsibility on us who have more wealth currently and unsustainable lifestyles to do more and to balance out.
Do you think it's because, well, not because, but one of the things is that in the developing or the global south, that they're not having as much impact as what we are because of our factories, because of our business and our consumerism?
Yeah, so consumerism, I would say that's the one to light upon. Our service industries, our consumption of goods, our habits of travel, our inefficiencies in energy use, for example, those are big drivers of the global emissions that are driving climate change. Now, per capita, someone in Bangladesh, for example, the average Bengali, is perhaps using, I think it's something like 0.1 of what would be the maximum carrying capacity for the planet. So if we all lived like an average Bangladeshi, there wouldn't be such a problem. Yeah. However, nobody has advocated, and I don't think anybody sane would seek to advocate that we all live in poverty. That's not an aspiration, and it's not going to fit with human nature either. So what we have to come to is an equitable balance globally between ourselves, so that people in the global south get opportunity to express themselves in terms of their education, their healthiness and well-being, their political voice, gender equality, so on and so forth, and also access a quality of life in terms of consumption, food, transport, housing, and so on, that is sustainable. And likewise, we've got to do the same in the north.
I was going to ask about electricity, because obviously that's a very important thing for everybody in the world, not just us. So electricity in the developing world, is that a priority? Should it be?
Yeah, I mean, for example, my last trip overseas was to work on our project in Sierra Leone, where, again, we're using UK aid money to support the development of secondary education. Part of that is about supplying solar lamps to households of girls who don't have any lighting at home and are unable to study in those conditions. So, yes, I mean, I think it's right that we're using, in the UK, we've reached the target of using 0.7% of our gross national income for aid. I think that's an appropriate and sustainable amount, and for some of that to provide practical assistance in a sustainable fashion to help people achieve their life opportunities. So for a girl to get an education is a good thing.
Yeah.
It's important in terms of her own human rights. It's also important in terms of her family and community, because girls' education produces excellent externalities for the people around her. And it then provides a platform for that country's economy to grow and move forwards.
So it's helping everyone, really. It's helping her family immediately, helping the country ultimately.
Yeah. What we don't want to do, though, is to encourage a situation where everyone aspires to and then apes, let's say, the lifestyle of an average American. Not wanting to pick on them particularly, but if we have those kinds of irresponsible consumption patterns reproduced as people get wealthier, then that'll be disastrous.
That's not sustainable.
No. So the kind of trajectory of development where people get access to what they need for well-being, such as lighting or transport, needs to be done in a way that facilitates the global carrying capacity to cope.
And you mentioned we've got a rights and responsibilities to actually make the planet a place that's sustainable and that's there for our future generations. Mm-hmm. So talking about population growth in the global south and wherever it is a problem, is there more to do in education for this particular problem, and how do we tackle that?
Yeah, so there are a number of factors that go in correlation together. I wouldn't necessarily want to pick on any one as kind of the cause for what's called the demographic transition, so the jump from poor people having very large families to much smaller families. That's well documented in national histories. It tends to go with a whole range of factors. So economic development, yes, education, access to health services, family planning services. The economics of it is critical, because if a family is better off and more secure in its income, then the chances of children surviving past infancy and childhood are much greater. So then the balance of the risks shifts from not having enough surviving children to look after you in old age to having sufficient to sustain the lifestyle that you want for all of your children. Because it's quite expensive if you've got half a dozen children or more and they're all surviving to teenage years.
And you've got to try and educate them all.
It's a lot of people to feed, a lot of people to educate, a lot of people to house and to move around and so on. So people, especially people in poverty, they make wise, very careful decisions at the margins around these things. Do I send my daughter to school today, or do I need her to go and weed the field or look after her younger sibling or work in the market?
So it's not that they don't care necessarily for the education, they just have to make those decisions.
Absolutely. And they'll make sensible decisions. So if they perceive that the schooling that their child is getting is not actually leading to any learning and any great benefit,
then pull them out.
Yeah. Wouldn't you?
If you don't see immediate benefit, yeah.
Exactly. You might have to. So, there's a thought experiment I always found really relevant when it was taught to me when I was at university first time round. And studied philosophy and psychology. But in philosophy, we were taught about John Rawls, who developed this thought experiment called the veil of ignorance. So if you bear with me,
carry on.
What you have to imagine is that we all have individual human identities. That's going to carry on. But what we won't know in this thought experiment is what our identity is going to be in the social structure that is being envisaged. So we have the opportunity to create a society and all the economic and social and power relations and wealth and gender identity and so on. But we don't know what position we're going to occupy in that new society. That's the veil of ignorance. So now the question is, how would we set up that society? Bearing in mind that, so to take an extreme example, one that's commonly used, let's say 10% of people in that society were going to be slaves, so that the other 90% of people could live without having any drudgery. having to do any manual labour and cleaning and chores. Well, that might be very nice for the 90%, but for the 10% who are slaves, it's appalling. They've got no rights. They've got a life of misery. And you don't know where you're going to end up. You might be a slave. You might be one of the better off. And it also then starts to unpack those feelings of discomfort. You know, if, let's say, you're a movie mogul or you're an aspiring actress, you know, are you going to want to set up that society so that it's okay for him to exploit you sexually in order for you to get a job opportunity? You might be the actress who's got to take those choices. Or even, how would you live with your conscience as that movie mogul, you know? So, to take that back to our discussion, you know, if you don't know, you know, whether you're going to be a citizen, let's say, of Malawi or of, you know, Holland, then how would you envisage setting up opportunities to access healthcare, education, consumption of energy, and so on? You mentioned electricity. But what I would say is all of us in society could do with adopting those sorts of mindsets in order perhaps to make better political choices about how we use the wealth that we're blessed with. You know, our tax income, our spare time, you know, equally.
Let's move on to sort of democracy, capitalism, business. So why would some policies that government put in place to stop carbon emissions be unpopular if most people are concerned about the environment? What's that conundrum there?
Okay, I mean, I'll accept your premise that most people are concerned about the environment. I think most people are moderately bothered about the environment, but
maybe it's just us, right?
Probably. Well,
I think everyone is.
I think a growing proportion of populations are conscious of the value of the environment and are committed to doing something positive about it. But it's not yet top of most people's priorities. For some people, the kids in the school strike movement, for example, you know, I think there's a groundswell of increasing activism around it, and that's a great thing to witness. But most people are, I would say, I mean, I'm generalizing very broadly, but I would say most people are kind of concerned with their own welfare, that of their families, the business that they're working in.
So if it affects them
their
directly,
everyday lives. Yeah. And then they will make choices at the margins according to the to the stimuli, the incentives that they're faced with. So, for example, if you made if you take the case of London and the poor air quality, you know, it got so bad that it was unhealthy. In fact, it still is above the level that standards recommend in many areas. So they introduced a congestion charge. It dissuades a lot of people from driving into London.
And people don't like it.
They take public transport instead. So they respond to the stimulus and the incentives that are in front of them. And they're making better decisions for us collectively. If you live in London, the air quality has improved greatly from when I grew up there in the 70s. But there's still further to go. And they're introducing a further congestion charge for high polluting vehicles now, you know, and so on. So you can keep adjusting, you know, the policy environment at the margins. You can make some things illegal. So the first mechanism was kind of economic. The trouble with that is, you know, wealthier people are perfectly at liberty to carry on polluting because they can afford it. So
they can pay the penalties for.
Yeah, you can carry on driving your four-wheel drive into Chelsea, you know, and shrug and pay, you know, double the charge. It won't dent your income. So that's not necessarily an equitable outcome, but at least, you know, fewer people are in a position to respond like that, so the air quality will improve. So that measure, you know, is imperfect. Then you've got, okay, you can have a legal framework. You can say it's illegal to do this behaviour that has bad externalities, that has bad impacts for the rest of us. So I read one tweet recently. It was saying in a rather provocative or flippant fashion, I drained my brake fluid onto the curb. I dumped a mattress in the river, and I sat outside my child's school with the engine idling to keep my car cool. I feel fine about those things because it's the system that has to change, not me. My actions are trivial. Now, we recognise that those actions are unacceptable these days. But I've been to plenty of developing countries where actually people are still having to flush out their engine oil onto the streets. They don't really have anywhere clean, for waste disposal to put it. No mechanisms in place. It doesn't make it a good thing that that's happening, but certain things are unacceptable to us in the West now. I couldn't and wouldn't want to drain my brake fluid down the drain outside my house.
You would feel a bit bad about that.
I'd feel bad about it, but I'd also know that one of my neighbours would rightly probably report me, and it would be an illegal form of pollution, just as dumping a mattress in the river would be and should be. Fly tipping isn't allowed, and it shouldn't be. So you can have a legal framework, you can have the kind of social approbation around it, you can have penalties and fines. And what we need to be is on a kind of trajectory of thinking, what are my other polluting behaviours that maybe need to have these costs built into them? So if I fly away on a holiday, because I want a nice vacation in a nice... Yeah.
It's all right, carry on.
Okay, should I go back a bit?
Maybe the vacation part, so if you fly.
So if I fly away on a holiday, because I want to spend my vacation in a nice sunny climate, there is a negative carbon impact of that behaviour. Well, I should presumably be paying for that because it's a discretionary behaviour. I don't have to fly away. I could spend my holiday here and still rest and recuperate. I couldn't guarantee the weather,
Well, this weekend you could.
Yeah, and I will.
Yeah.
But what we should maybe be moving to in terms of policy, is a recognition that those costs should be built into those services and goods that we're buying, not just left to be absorbed free by the environment that can't cope. So, to bring it back to your question, why aren't we requiring our governments to behave like that and recognise the prices, the full lifetime price of our behaviours? Well, it's because at the end of the day we're perhaps a bit more narrow-minded, locally focused, and concerned about costs at the margins rather than the long-term sustainability of our choices.
So, Jake, it's an interesting conversation, and I'll, not that I really know where I stand on this, and because it's changed over the years. But capitalism, socialism, because I want to talk about business, and is it to blame for the harm being done to the environment? But really, it's not just business, is it? It's because it's all part of a big mechanism. We're part of the call for businesses to produce more. So from a political point of view, does something need to change, or is capitalism the evil, or is it not, or is it something that we can't really ask the question about? We can't blame capitalism for that.
Well, you can certainly ask the question, and I think we should be asking those sorts of questions.
Yeah.
What's quite odd in a sense is that I feel like we're asking those sorts of questions a lot less than when I was a student, for example, and things were much more black and white in terms of the Cold War and the ideology.
Is it becoming a bit more mixed in now? We don't really know.
Well, I think the global dominance of the capitalist model in economics is pretty well absolute. You've got a few pockets of countries like Laos, where I lived, which is still a one-party, supposedly communist state, but there are very few and far between. And even they have to operate within the global consensus, which is market economics. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't challenge the power assumptions that underpin that dominant global setup.
Or we're limiting ourselves because there may be a different system of running a government, right? Something that we've never seen before. What do you think?
Well, there may well be. I get very frustrated by the outcomes that we get from democratic choices of our governments. They don't seem to be delivering the scale and the urgency of action on climate change that we need them to take in terms of leadership. Yes, so there are increasingly strident voices around the fact that we need a new model of politics and economics. I think that's helpful. Those sorts of pressure groups are providing a fresh voice.
Greenpeace as well, perhaps?
Yeah. And I think there's a certain maturity of thinking around, we have to recognise that the market has been incredibly successful at providing goods and services to billions of people in a form that they desire. So it's very difficult to unseat that mechanism. But what I think we have to do is recognise that there's no such thing as a free market. The market, even if it's a supposedly liberal one, is structured according to the interests of the people who control it.
So someone might be losing out,
multinationals, right? Well, certainly they are, because if you count it as a benefit of the market that I can go to a high street store and buy a T-shirt for £2 or a fiver, yes, it's nice and cheap for me as a consumer, but it's appalling for the woman or man in a sweatshop factory who's working, dozens of hours a week for a very low wage. They get a very small share of the bounty that is the global clothing textiles market. We could make better choices around those sorts of consumer activities, but just leaving it to consumers is probably not going to get us to where we want to be to end up with this socially just and ecologically sustainable world.
Because you mentioned it earlier, that why would you want to do that? I think humans always, they're looking after their own welfare, so psychologically, why would I want to be concerned about that person?
Well, one reason would be because one of the defining characteristics of us as humans is our imagination, our capacity to think ourselves into the life of that teenager working in
their shoes.
In a Bangladeshi textile factory. I mean, I've visited Bangladesh. I can see, the benefits, because she's now got an income that she wouldn't have had if she was just working in a paddy field, and she's probably got an education to get to that point. So the country's moving forwards, but we could do better at evening out those inequalities globally.
Is it something that, because you've been there, you've experienced these different places, has that been beneficial to you? Because you think about it, would you encourage people to say, hey, get out your seats and go and visit these places and be awakened? Or
well, I couldn't really do that unless you were going by bicycle or something. I'd be hypocritical, wouldn't I? If everyone was jumping on a plane to Dhaka. It has been beneficial for me. I've had an interesting and fulfilling life because I feel like I've tried to make a contribution to some aspects of this. I'd say it's been beneficial for my children. They came back into secondary education in England and found, peers who didn't have any sense of what it's like to, be driven to a decent school past children who are sitting in the streets, unable to get an education at all. Now, they're privileged, but they have a perspective and a solidarity that they'll carry through into their adult lives and choices, I hope. And influence their peers in turn. Fortunately, we don't have to all get on a plane to Zambia or so on to appreciate that. We have TV, the media, the radio, so on, social media. Having said that, those are quite complex filters, because if you think about the controversy around comic relief, for example, there was this whole challenge to what's her name, Stacey Dooley.
Stacey Dooley, yeah.
Holding, I think, a Malawian child or wherever she was, and you get these tropes of the white saviour narrative. As well-meaning as she is, the question is, can't we move beyond that now that we're getting into the middle of the 21st century? Can't we do a bit better than just keep repeating these sorts of narratives to tug on our heartstrings and get a few donations once a year?
So, yeah, so more could be done, do we think? I mean...
Yeah, so a lot more needs to be done on a lot of fronts, and part of it, I think, is about that sense of empathy and awareness, and understanding of our own responsibility to make different choices. And I'm no different, I'm carrying too much weight because I've eaten too much food of the wrong kinds. I have a house that, as I say, energy efficient as it is more than, if everybody on the planet had the same sort of housing as me, then we wouldn't have enough planet to go around, and so on. So we've all got more to do in this regard. It's not like I'm pointing fingers or holding myself up as some paragon, but I hope to be making better choices at the margins as my awareness increases and try and bring my behaviour into line with what's sustainable.
And I'm glad you spoke about that, because I wanted to talk about the psychology behind our choices, the way we do things. And I've just been hearing you talk, and underlying a lot of that is about the psychology behind the choices that we make and such. So I believe there's a greater awareness happening, because you mentioned empathy and awareness, and I think that's something that's not concerning me at the moment, but in my own personal life, I'm trying to increase sympathy, empathy, and compassion. Because I've got different reasons to do that now. Because I got a wife and 4 kids, and so I have to have a bit more compassion than what I would have had if I was single. And so there seems to be a greater awareness happening relating to our connection to our bodies and to the spiritual. And this new awareness has been made evidenced by findings such as the energy field that drives the universe. I don't know if you've heard of that before. But it seems to me that it's more than just us respecting our environment, but more a perspective that we are in relationship to it, or with the environment. And we're included in its harmony and its cooperation. So do you agree with that that people are becoming a bit more aware of their surroundings and nature, and how we kind of connect with nature? And is that maybe one of the reasons why we are becoming concerned about the environment?
That's interesting. I mean, I don't know if I'm in a position to judge whether we're more aware than we used to be or not. There have always been movements like paganism, Druidism.
Always been there in the background, in history, yeah.
Animism and so on in pretty much every culture, where people have had a sense of our connectedness to the universe, to the natural world, an appreciation of it in its own terms and our part in it, without necessarily having to refer to an outside deity or an additional spiritual mechanism or whatever. As for whether or not we have more of that now or not, I'm not sure. But I mean, what I would say from my own perspective is, I'm very conscious that we as human beings are just another form of animal. There's nothing really differentiating us from, the whales and the mice and rats, and then in turn from birds and reptiles and ultimately bacteria and so on. We share a lot of DNA. What distinguishes us as human beings has been the sophistication of our brains, the connectedness that allows us to process information, develop a culture, transmit knowledge and skills from person to person and place to place, and connect up in ways that get beyond just the immediate social group, which is where animals are kind of locked in at. So through language, through the transmission of ideas and so on, now we have a global culture to some extent, and can dip in and out of that.
It seems like we might be the stewards of the natural world in a way.
Yeah, so we've ended up in this preeminent position where we're affecting, I think it's incontrovertible. I know some people will deny it, but we're having an effect on the biosphere. We are a part of it. I'm an out-and-out materialist. I think that
We can't see ourselves as separate from it.
No, I mean, we are part of the environment. You only need to, attend a funeral to know, we return to ashes and dust. That's how it is. And that's where we came from. We're made of those same carbon and oxygen and potassium atoms and so on. We're just put together in a really sophisticated fashion that gives us these additional phenomena. I mean, you can call it spirituality or a soul or, art or beauty, whatever. I think those are inextricable from the material world, but they're no less valuable because they have a material root. And I think, yes, the more that we understand how precious these islands of life and organisation and beauty and connectedness, love, it's a great privilege to live this life, and we definitely do have a responsibility to the other species we share the planet with, the entire planetary system, and to future generations of all species, not just our own, to do a better job of that stewardship.
Good. So I want to ask a last question, which actually I think we've already answered, because we spoke about a more earth-conscious worldview or a mindset. So I was going to talk about our school children protesting, and you've got children at that age, I think in sixth form?
A couple in university, one in sixth form.
Yeah, and why are they doing it? I mean, what do you think is the reason that they're leaving school for a day and going to protest? What's that about?
Well, I think they recognise that our generation, my generation, is not providing the kind of leadership around these issues yet that is translating into action, as I say, at a big enough scale, across enough sectors, and urgently enough to get us onto that trajectory.
And they know this somehow.
Yeah. Well, because we've not been completely asleep at the wheel, so we've done a half-decent job of educating.
You're telling them about it.
Ourselves and them about the fact that, if we don't achieve the 1.5 degree increase, maximum increase in global warming by 2030, then there are going to be horrendous consequences.
And it's
We're
their
already
future,
feeling
right?
a lot of it.
Yeah,
it's their future, but also, I mean, we should be looking 1,000 years ahead and 10,000 years ahead. I mean, this planet's been around for what is it?
Billions.
Yeah, 13 billion years or something? Or is that the whole universe? I can't quite remember.
The whole universe.
But anyway,
14 billion.
Billions. So I'm not just talking about my kids and my grandchildren. Not that I've got any yet. But
Soon.
not too soon, I hope. Girls, if you're listening. But yeah, we've got to have a lot more solidarity across the planet with all people currently, and into the future with all species down the generations. That needs to start urgently now, and I think they get that. And they're not hearing it from the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, the Liberal Democrats, and the Ulster Unionists. The Greens are saying some of it, but they don't really have a lot of traction in our parliamentary politics.
Where are they hearing it? Just from parents and teachers, or?
Well, the media. I mean, I think people are educated in a very broad sense, and there's a lot more coverage than there ever has been about the climate crisis, sustainability. I mean, I suppose I do my share of banging on about it, but it's not just my children turning out there by any means. So I really admire the leadership of people like Greta Thunberg from Sweden, who's
was that the young girl,
inspiring
16-year-old, and she gave a speech at
So she's instigated the school strikes that have now spread across the world, developing countries and developed alike. People like Malala Yousafzai, who campaigns on behalf of education, particularly for girls, having been attacked by the Taliban, nearly fatally wounded. These people are really inspiring. They're brave, articulate, and I think if they become our leaders, then we have half a chance.
And they are affecting, their message is getting out to the developing world and those who are, not in the West, as it were, or the global North.
Yeah.
And that's good, isn't it?
Yeah. Malala's from Pakistan. I've seen tweets from photos of school strikes from, Uganda and
so it's not just happening in the UK?
No, not at all. And that is really encouraging. That is where, education and this joined up imagination, the global culture, really has an opportunity for things to, to go viral and get real traction.
So last question, if you did have a magic wand, given your area of expertise and interest, which is international development and sustainability, how could you wave that wand so that in 50 years' time things could be different? I'm not saying you have to have one magic pill, but what needs to be done really as the next steps?
Well, I think one thing that would be really helpful is if there was better awareness of what's called the 10 billion diet. So you can look it up in the Lancet, and it's been published widely in the media. You can look for it on the BBC and so on. So a diet that would mean that we as individuals are healthier because of the balance of nutrition that we take in. Across the world now, as many people are suffering from illnesses related to obesity as they are from malnutrition. That's the first time in history that's ever happened. If we carry on that trajectory, it's miserable for everyone. So, better health individually. Secondly, it's called the 10 billion diet because even if the global population rose to 10 billion, there would still be enough food to feed the world. And thirdly, it will safeguard the biosphere, so it won't destroy the planet if we all eat in this fashion. And what it involves is a balance of small portion, maybe once a week, a burger-sized portion of meat, or a little bit of fish or chicken, I think 1 or 2 portions a week, small amount of dairy, and the balance is mainly vegetables and pulses and legumes. Not too much starchy vegetables. If we all ate that, we'd be healthier. The global population could all be adequately fed,
better for the environment.
Yeah, and
better on the health
environment
services
would survive. So I think if we all made those sorts of choices, we ought to recognise we have some individual agency over what decisions we make. Obviously, just my choices alone out of 8 billion people on the planet isn't going to make that much impact, but if we all do it, it does make that impact.
Definitely.
The other thing to bear in mind, and you and I have already made the wrong choice in this regard, is we shouldn't be having more than 2 children each. I've already got 3, and you've admitted to 4. Well, that's done and dusted. But I would encourage people to have smaller families, lobby and make consumer choices around our energy mix and our transport, so that we're not adding to the emissions burden on the planet. And where we can afford to offset those, by paying organisations to plant trees, to provide more efficient stoves, to pay for insulation, and so on, so that at least we're not adding to the burden and the problem that we have to fix down the line.
Brilliant. Jake Ross, it's been great having you on the Life Shot. And perhaps in a few months or years we can have a round 2 and talk about some more interesting things. As you know, that we could probably talk hours about this stuff. But it's been great having you on the show. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you, Clint. It's been a pleasure.
For more amazing episodes and interviews, check out lifeshot.podbean.com. Thanks for listening.